the big challenge of our time is how do you get plentiful, reliable electricity and energy without destroying the climate? Well, I started out as an anti-nuclear activist, and I quickly got involved in advocating for renewable energy. So at the early part of this century, I helped to start a labor union and environmentalist alliance called the Apollo Alliance. And we pushed for a big investment in clean energy, solar, wind, electric cars. And the investment idea was picked up by President Obama. And during his time in office, he invested about $150 billion to make solar and wind and electric cars much cheaper than they were. And that was having a lot of success, but we were starting to notice some challenges. Some of them you're familiar with. Solar and wind generate electricity about 10 to 30% of the time, so we're dependent on the weather for solar and wind. There were other problems we were noticing, though. Sometimes these sources of electricity generate too much power, and you hear a lot of hype about batteries, but we actually don't have sufficient storage, even in California, where we have a lot of investment, a lot of Silicon Valley types putting money into battery storage technology. So we're trying to figure out how do you manage all those renewables. And while we were struggling with this problem, around 2005, Stuart Brand came out and he said, we should rethink nuclear power. And this was like a shock to the system. I mean, for me and for all of my friends, I mean, Stuart was one of the first big advocates of solar energy anywhere. In the late 60s and early 70s, he advised the governor of California. But he said, look, we've been trying to do solar for a long time, and at the time, so we have less than 0.5% of our electricity globally comes from solar, about 2% from wind, and the majority comes from nuclear and hydro. And he said, look, despite what you might think, according to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, nuclear actually produces 4 times less carbon emissions than solar does. And in fact, that's why they recommended in their most recent report that achieving deep cuts in emissions is going to require a more intensive use of renewables, nuclear, and carbon capture and storage. Well, let's take a closer look at Germany. So Germany gets the majority of its electricity and, of course, all of its transportation fuels from fossil fuels. So just the electrical sector, last year Germany got 40% of its electricity from coal, it got 12% from natural gas, 13% from nuclear, 12% from wind, and about 6% from solar. So to go from 18% wind and solar to 100%, you actually have to go beyond that. If you're replacing all of the transportation sector with electric cars, you're looking at something more like 150%. So Germany's done a lot to invest in renewables and to innovate solar and wind, but that's still a pretty steep climb. That's even before you get to the question of storage. So, well, let's take a look at what happened last year. Last year, Germany installed 4% more solar panels, but it generated 3% less electricity from solar. And even when I'm in meetings with energy experts, I'll ask people if they can make a guess as to why that is. And you'd be shocked at how many energy experts have no idea. It just wasn't very sunny last year in Germany. Well, that probably meant, though, then that it was windier, right? Because if it's not as sunny, then maybe there's some more wind, and those two things can balance each other out. In truth, Germany installed 11% more wind turbines in 2016, but it got 2% less electricity from wind. Same story, just not very windy last year. So you might think, well, we just have to do a lot more solar and wind so that in years where there's not a lot of sunlight and wind, that there's more electricity from those energy sources. So Germany's plan is to increase by 50% the amount of electricity Germany gets from solar. That would take you from 40 gigawatts to about 60 gigawatts in 2030. But if you have a year like 2016, that means that you'll still only be getting around 9% of your total electricity from solar. And this is in really the biggest solar country in the world. I mean, Germany is really the powerhouse of renewable electricity. So the obvious response is, well, we'll just put it all in batteries. We hear so much about batteries. You would think that we're just have a huge amount of storage. Well, our staff took a look at the numbers in California, and what we discovered is that we have 23 minutes of electricity storage for California's grid. But to get that 23 minutes requires using every battery in every car and truck in the state, which, as you can imagine, is not super practical if you're trying to get somewhere. And Germany might be a little bit different, but not very different from that.
We've been hearing a lot about how solar panels and wind turbines have come down in cost in recent years, but that cost has been significantly outweighed by just the challenges of integrating all of that unreliable power onto the grid. Just take, for instance, what's happened in California. At the period in which solar panels have come down in price very significantly, same with wind, we've seen our electricity prices go up 5 times more than the rest of the country. And it's not unique to us. You can see the same phenomenon happened in Germany, which is really the world's leader in solar, wind, and other renewable technologies. Their prices increased 50% during their big renewable energy push. Now, you might think, well, dealing with climate change is just going to require that we all pay more for energy. That's what I used to think. But consider the case of France. France actually gets twice as much of its electricity from clean, zero-emission sources than does Germany. And yet, France pays half as much, almost half as much for its electricity. How can that be? Well, you might have already anticipated the answer. France gets most of its electricity from nuclear power, about 75% in total. And nuclear just ends up being a lot more reliable, generating power 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, for about 90% of the year. We see this phenomenon show up at a global level. So, for example, there's been a natural experiment over the last 40 years, even more than that, in terms of the deployment of nuclear and the deployment of solar. You can see that at a little bit higher cost, we got about half as much electricity from solar and wind than we did from nuclear. Well, what does all this mean for going forward? I think one of the most significant findings to date is this one. Had Germany spent $580 billion on nuclear instead of renewables, it would already be getting 100% of its electricity from clean energy sources and all of its transportation energy. Now, I think you might be wondering, and it's quite reasonable to ask, is nuclear power safe? And what do you do with the waste? Well, those are very reasonable questions. Turns out that there's been scientific studies on this going over 40 years. This is just the most recent study that was done by the prestigious British medical journal Lancet, finds that nuclear power is the safest. It's easy to understand why. According to the World Health Organization, about 7 million people die annually from air pollution, and nuclear plants don't emit that. What about environmental impact? Well, I think a really easy way to think about it is that uranium fuel, which is what we use to power nuclear plants, is just really energy dense. About the same amount of uranium as this Rubik's Cube can power all of the energy that you need in your entire life. As a consequence, you just don't need that much land in order to produce a significant amount of electricity. Here you can compare the solar farm I just described, Ivanpah, to California's last nuclear plant, Diablo Canyon. It takes 450 times more land to generate the same amount of electricity as it does from nuclear. You would need 17 more solar farms like Ivanpah in order to generate the same output as Diablo Canyon, and of course it would then be unreliable. Solar panels require 17 times more materials than nuclear plants do, in the form of cement, glass, concrete, steel, and that includes all the fuel used for those nuclear plants. All of the waste from the Swiss nuclear program fits into this room. Nuclear waste is actually the only waste from electricity production that's safely contained and internalized. Every other way of making electricity emits the waste into the natural environment, either as pollution or as material waste. We tend to think of solar panels as clean, but the truth is that there is no plan to deal with solar panels at the end of their 20 or 25-year life. A lot of experts are actually very concerned that solar panels are just going to be shipped to poor countries in Africa or Asia with the rest of our electronic waste stream to be disassembled, often exposing people to really high levels of toxic elements, including lead, cadmium, and chromium, elements that, because they're elements, their toxicity never declines over time. I think we have an intuitive sense that nuclear is a really powerful, strong energy source, and that sunlight is really dilute and diffuse and weak, which is why you have to spread solar collectors or wind collectors over such a large amount of land. And in terms of solar, you know, building a solar farm is a lot like building any other kind of farm. You have to clear the whole area of wildlife. So this is a picture of 1/3 of one of the biggest solar farms in California called Ivanpah. In order to build this, they had to clear the whole area of desert tortoises, literally pulling desert tortoises and their babies out of burrows, putting them on the back of pickup trucks and transporting them to captivity, where many of them ended up dying. And currently, the current estimates are that about 6,000 birds are killed every year, actually catching on fire above the solar farm and plunging to their deaths. What do kill eagles and other big birds like this kite as well as owls and condors and other threatened and endangered species, are wind turbines. In fact, they're one of the most significant threats to those big bird species that we have. We just haven't been introducing the airspace with many other objects like we have wind turbines over the last several years. Hundreds of thousands of birds are killed every year by wind turbines. What I didn't mention is that 1 million bats at a minimum are killed every year by wind. The good news is that I think that people still care about nature enough for these facts to matter. In Europe, we saw the Netherlands is one of the first countries in recent memory to actually announce, as they did last week, that they're going to start to increase their reliance on nuclear power in recognition that there's just no way they could generate significant amounts of energy enough from solar and wind to meet their climate targets. I think it's natural that those of us that became very concerned about climate change, such a big environmental issue, would gravitate towards really romantic solutions like harmonizing human civilization with the natural world using renewable energies. But I think it's also understandable that as the facts have come in, that many of us have started to question our prior beliefs and change our minds. For me, the question now is, now that we know that renewables can't save the planet, are we going to keep letting them destroy it?